I have been saving money since I was 22 years old to buy a rental property. I ate instant noodles, drove a beat-up Honda, and worked overtime every weekend. Finally, last month, I found the perfect deal. It was a large, two-story house in a nice neighborhood. The price was surprisingly low, almost too good to be true. The seller was an elderly man named Mr. Henderson who seemed desperate to sell. He told me the tenants were quiet and paid cash, but he was just too old to manage the upkeep anymore. I signed the papers, transferred the money, and officially became a landlord. The day after closing, I drove over to introduce myself to the tenants. The downstairs tenant was a nice librarian who had lived there for 5 years. She congratulated me on the purchase, but then she gave me a weird look. She asked if I had met the guy upstairs yet, a man named Gary. I told her I hadn't. She lowered her voice and told me that Gary had been making a lot of noise lately. She said it sounded like he was doing construction up there at all hours of the night. I wasn't to worry. Mer. Henderson had told me Gary was a handyman, so I figured he was just fixing a leaky faucet or maybe hanging some shelves. I walked up the exterior stairs to the second floor unit and knocked on the door. No answer. But I could hear loud banging and the sound of a power saw coming from inside. I unlocked the door with my master key and shouted hello. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. The living room was empty. There was no furniture, just stacks of lumber, bags of cement, and drywall everywhere. But the real shock was looking at the ceiling. In the middle of the hallway, there was a jagged, hand-cut hole leading up into the attic space. A crude wooden ladder was nailed to the wall leading up into the darkness. Suddenly, a head popped down through the hole. It was Gary. He was wearing a tool belt and covered in sawdust. He looked at me and asked who I was. I told him I was the new owner and asked what on earth he was doing. Gary climbed down and wiped his hands on his jeans. He smiled proudly and told me he was expanding the unit. He said the attic was wasted space, so he decided to turn it into a third-floor penthouse master suite with a balcony. I stood there blinking. I asked him if he had a permit for this. Gary laughed. He said permits were just a government scam to take money from working people. He told me he knew what he was doing because he used to watch a lot of home renovation shows. He pointed to the corner and said he had already cut through the roof trusses to make room for a skylight. My blood ran cold. Roof trusses hold the house together. You cannot just cut them. I told Gary to stop everything immediately. I told him he had compromised the structural integrity of the house and he needed to leave so I could get an engineer in there. Gary's face turned red. He stepped closer to me and told me that this was his home. He said he had put $10,000 of his own money into materials, and if I wanted him to stop, I would have to reimburse him for his sweat equity. He told me that as a tenant, he had a right to improve his living space, and if I tried to evict him, he would sue me for harassment. I left the unit and went straight to my car. My hands were shaking. I called a structural engineer I knew. He came out 2 hours later. We went upstairs, and when the engineer saw the cut trusses, he actually gasped. He told me that the roof was currently being held up by nothing but plywood and hope. He said if we got a heavy snow or a strong wind, the entire roof could collapse and crush the librarian downstairs. That was the moment I stopped being nice. I didn't call a lawyer. I called code enforcement. The city inspector arrived the next morning. When he walked into Gary's unit and saw the staircase to nowhere in the unauthorized third floor, his eyes nearly popped out of his head. He climbed up the ladder, looked at the roof, and came back down with a grim face. He took out a bright orange sticker and slapped it on the front door. It said condemned and safe for human occupancy. Gary came running out of the bedroom screaming. He yelled at the inspector, saying he couldn't kick him out because he had tenant rights. The inspector looked at Gary and calmly told him that gravity doesn't care about tenant rights. He told Gary he had 4 hours to gather his personal belongings and vacate the premises before the police arrived to escort him off the property. Gary turned to me. He was furious. He told me I had ruined his investment. He said he was going to turn that third floor into an Airbnb and we could have split the profits. I told him that he didn't own the house. I did. And he had just destroyed my roof. Gary was removed by the police that afternoon. But the story didn't end there. Because the house was condemned, I had to pay for emergency shoring to keep the roof from caving in. It cost me $15,000 to fix the damage Gary caused. I kept a security deposit, obviously, but that was only 1 month's rent. So I took him to court. In court, Gary actually tried to argue that he had increased the square footage of the house, so I should be thanking him. He brought receipts for the lumber and tried to countersue me for the cost of materials. The judge looked at the photos of the cut trusses and the orange condemned sticker. He looked at Gary and asked if he was a licensed contractor. Gary said no. The judge asked if he had written permission from the owner. Gary said no. The judge ruled in my favor in less than 10 minutes. He ordered Gary to pay for the entire cost of the repairs, plus legal fees, totaling over $22,000. He also denied Gary's request to get his lumber back. It took me 3 months to fix the house. I had to hire a real contractor to rebuild the roof and remove the illegal staircase. When we tore down Gary's work, we found out he had wired the new electrical outlets with extension cords duct taped inside the walls. If I hadn't caught him when I did, the house probably would have burned down before the roof collapsed. The house is fixed now. I have a new tenant upstairs. He is an accountant. I made sure to check his background thoroughly, and the first thing I told him when he moved in was that the attic is strictly off limits. He laughed and said he is afraid of heights anyway. I still drive by the house sometimes and look at the roof line, just to make sure it's straight. And every time I pay my mortgage, I think of Gary and the $22,000 debt he will be paying off for the rest of his life. Have you ever had a tenant or a neighbor who decided to do their own DIY renovations on your property? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story of landlord justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more.